Chris simply vanished. And when I say vanished, I need y'all to listen to me. Chris simply vanished. Chris simply vanished.
The morning of the 25th of January 2002 started like any other for 20-year-old surveyor Christopher Tompkins. Saying goodbye to his mother, he left home for work at 8:10, just like he would on every other day. He met his 3 colleagues, and together, the 4-man surveyor team began what was a typical day, surveying through a lightly wooded area near County Line Road, close to Highway 85 in Ellerslie, Georgia, USA. The team moved in a fixed line formation, with each man distanced roughly 50 feet apart, with one in front of the other. They were aligned this way as they walked in the same direction through the area. Christopher was at the back, but was easily within eyesight of the man in front of him, and was in regular communication with his colleagues. And here is where the normal day turned into a mystery. One moment, the surveyor in front of him was talking to Christopher, and just a few seconds later, he looked back to find that he was no longer there. Confused and probably slightly shocked, the surveyor alerted the others and explained what had just happened, and together they searched the area. It didn't make any sense to them. There was nowhere he could have gone to without being seen. Just a short distance away, they soon found one of Christopher's work boots, strangely, just hanging from a barbed wire fence, with no other sign of his other boot. In very close proximity to the boot, they also found some of his work tools, blue fabric from his work clothes, and 12 cents, which is believed to belong to him since it looked clean and freshly fallen. And it seems that was all that was left of him. The other surveyors kept up the search, but stopped at around 1 p.m, roughly 4 hours after Christopher disappeared. This is when they decided to call their boss to let him know that Christopher was missing, but his mother was not told until 4:15 p.m. After 24 hours, a missing persons report was filed, and the authorities began their search, but no further clues were uncovered. Shortly after the initial search, a more intense investigation of the area involving dogs was launched, but still, nothing was found. Weirdly, months later, Christopher's other boot was found on a private property 900 yards from where Christopher had originally gone missing. If the events took place exactly as the other surveyors say, it's as if Christopher practically went missing in the blink of an eye, leaving behind only a boot, some loose change, and a few tools. But how on earth is that even possible? Where could he have gone? Why were there no other signs of him anywhere? The dogs didn't even pick up his scent. The disappearance is as much of a mystery today as it was in 2002. Naturally, foul play was one of the first theories. Why had his colleagues not reported the disappearance sooner, especially since the circumstances were so strange? The hours in between his disappearance and them reporting it were more than enough time for them to dispose of him, along with any evidence, and then for them to come up with an explanation. But if this was true, why would they come up with such a strange, almost paranormal story? There was also no clear motive for them to harm him. No evidence of foul play was ever discovered either, but none of the other surveyors were ever seriously considered a suspect, and therefore were never interrogated or investigated further. Some believe they need to be questioned again. Another theory suggests that Christopher had just walked away and started a new life somewhere, but why would anyone do this in such a bizarre manner, leaving behind a single boot and a small pile of pocket change? Surely the best way to run away would to have been not to turn up to work at all. Calling in sick, perhaps. However, this theory was still backed by his bosses, who said that Christopher had been acting strangely in the days leading to his disappearance. His mother strongly denied that there was anything wrong with her son. In an interview with the Ledger Enquirer, she said, "Chris lived with me and I saw him every day. There was neither strange behaviour on his part, nor any distress." Christopher's friends and family all described him as well-adjusted and happy. His colleagues added that he was a respectable, hard-working young man, so his disappearance is very out of character. Another theory put forward was the possibility that he might have been attacked by a wild animal, but this idea was quickly dismissed, since there would have clearly been evidence to support such an attack. Also, how could this possibly happen so quickly and within eyesight of his colleagues, without any of them knowing? One paranormal theory was the suggestion that some mysterious and very powerful force had picked him up and taken him away, with his belongings being dropped and caught on the fence as he was carried off. Another was that he had stepped into some kind of vortex or time slip, but then how did his belongings end up where they did? With every possible theory, from the bizarre to the logical, there is immediately a detail that contradicts it, and that's one of the saddest things about the disappearance of Chris Tompkins. There is absolutely no sense of closure, and that will continue to haunt all those that knew him. Some of you may already be familiar with the mysterious sickness that seemed to target American diplomats and CIA operatives based in Cuba in 2015. The sickness came to be known as Havana syndrome. For those of you who already know about the strange events that took place in Cuba, there were more cases reported elsewhere that you may not have heard about, but more on that later. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the story that originally starts in Cuba, here's what went down. In attempts to further improve their diplomatic relationship, the US and Cuba both reopened their embassies in each other's countries in July 2015. Everything appeared to be going well until December 2016, when an American CIA operative started hearing a strange noise in his apartment. The man in question put up with the noise for as long as he could, until he eventually ended up going to the American Embassy's health center in Havana, suffering from nausea, headaches, and dizziness. At first, it was thought that crickets or cicadas, another noise-making insect, were the source of the strange sound. Here's what they sound like. However, it would soon turn out that insects were not to blame. A report on the incident was sent to Washington, but nothing came of it. Then, in February 2017, 2 more agents reported hearing strange sounds, which included buzzing, something high-pitched, and even a noise that closely resembled marbles rolling along the floor. In these cases, the symptoms were more significant. Not only did they suffer from headaches and dizziness, they also experienced motor issues and tinnitus, which most often manifests as a constant ringing noise in your ears. Suspiciously, the strange, harmful noises only appeared to be affecting US personnel based at the Havana embassy, which helped remove the cicada and cricket theory, since those would have been heard by everyone. The symptoms were very much like patients who had damaged inner ears. The Cuban government denied any involvement when confronted by the head of the US embassy, and it does seem rather strange that they would consider targeting Americans in this way, considering all that they had gained by rebuilding an economic relationship with the United States. An investigation took place, but no evidence to link the Cubans or even the Russians was uncovered. March came, and even more US officials were reporting the same symptoms. There were even cases where individuals didn't report the strange noises, but still had the same signs that they were targeted. September rolled around, and the total had now reached 16 agents from the CIA, as well as up to 10 other US civil servants. Worryingly, Months after their original symptoms started, more began to develop. Victims now started to experience insomnia, sickness, loss of consciousness, nosebleeds, vision impairment, memory loss, and the inability to concentrate. They even started showing signs of brain damage. If by now you're still not convinced something suspicious was going on, the fact the doctor the US sent out to treat and evaluate the victims also suffered the same symptoms too might just do it. In 2019, the brain scan results of the US Embassy staff who became ill in this mysterious case were published. The scans taken from 40 US government workers revealed that some brain features appeared different to those of healthy volunteers. The images of a victim's brain showed that on average they had lower volumes of white matter, which is the tissue made from nerve bundles that send signals around the brain. They also showed microstructural differences and other abnormalities that could affect auditory and visuospatial processing. Eventually, it was revealed that 14 Havana-based Canadian officials also fell victim. As a result, the American and Canadian governments withdrew all non-essential staff. The main suspects were Cuba, Russia, and China, but there was still no evidence to support these theories, and all denied any involvement. Both the American and Canadian governments were certain that an unknown radio or electromagnetic emitting device was being used. They were even able to record it. Here is a short sample. You can see why crickets and cicadas were originally considered. Even with the sound now being captured, they still had no idea what exactly was causing it, and the recordings didn't seem to further the investigation. That now brings us up to speed. Here is where the plot thickens. In late May 2018, news broke that the same symptoms of the mysterious Havana syndrome had been reported at a United States consulate in southern China. In some cases, these people and their families were evacuated as early as April 2018. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo spoke at a hearing of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and said that the symptoms of the first American victim in Guangzhou are very similar and entirely consistent with the medical indications that have taken place to Americans working in Cuba. Along with family members, there were roughly 170 American diplomats or employees based in Guangzhou. A senior American official said that a sizable number of these would undergo testing by the State Department doctors, who arrived on May 31st of that year. It seems like that testing must have shown something significant, because shortly after the doctors arrived, more news began to emerge stating that 9 more US diplomats were also evacuated, all reporting the same symptoms. One of the only outspoken victims was a man called Mark Lindsay. Lindsay was an engineering security officer at the American consulate in Guangzhou. He was one of those 9 evacuated along with his wife. Going back as far as a year, he and his wife said they experienced headaches, sleeplessness and nausea after hearing the strange noise, which they described as marbles bouncing and hitting a floor, then rolling on an incline with a static sound. Mr. Lindsay believes his position in the diplomatic security department could have made him a target. You see, before joining the Foreign Service in 2011, Mr. Lindsay had worked with the International Republican Institute, promoting democratic reforms in Ukraine and Georgia, 2 countries where Russia has denounced American involvement. He also said there was classified material that pointed to the country that had been carrying out the attacks, but the State Department denied him access to the documents. He went further to suggest that top officials know exactly which country is behind it all, adding that he believes it wasn't Cuba or China, but another country, one which the Secretary of State and President do not want to confront. Years after returning from China, there is still no official word about what happened to Mr. Lindsay and the other potential victims. In 2019, an article was published that gave some details about the current status of Mr. Lindsay. Sadly, at one point his headaches became so extreme, he ended up being referred to Dr. Tina Shetty, the neurologist for the New York Giants American football team. She said that she had never seen a case like his before, adding that he displayed symptoms which were consistent with those seen in mild traumatic brain injuries. Further news articles were released in December 2020, discussing a US government report on what had happened in Cuba, and indicated that the mysterious noise and subsequent illness is a little closer to being solved. The report officially stated that the mystery illness suffered by US diplomats in Cuba could have been the result of a microwave energy weapon. While not conclusively stating it as fact, this is still a pretty major development, considering at one point insects were thought to be responsible. The report by the National Academies of Sciences did not point the finger of blame. However, it did say that research into the effects of pulsed radio frequency energy was carried out by the Soviet Union more than 50 years ago. In July 2021, the United States Department of State confirmed they were conducting an investigation into more alleged attacks in the Austrian city of Vienna. Over 20 US officials were affected, all reporting the same Havana syndrome type symptoms. Not every instance of Havana syndrome has been so comfortably far away from home. A few days after Thanksgiving in 2019, an official from the White House was taking her dog for a walk in Arlington, Virginia, when her dog started convulsing. The official then started to experience an intense headache and ringing in her ears as the side of her face began to tingle. A more recent domestic incident took place within close range of the White House in November 2020. Another official was stricken by the same intense headache and ringing in the ears as they walked by the ellipse, the lawn on the south side of the White House itself. It's been reported that experts at the Pentagon are now working on a wearable device to detect incoming attacks, and no doubt they're trying to figure out a way to shield or counteract against this pretty worrying technology. Recorded by a local resident back in 2015, this footage of a mysterious, ghostly, city-like apparition appeared in the skies of Foshan, China. At the time, Chinese TV news reports mentioned how thousands of city residents in two areas reported seeing the huge city forming in the skies. The apparition, which was witnessed by many, was only visible for a few minutes before completely disappearing. The local news and meteorological reporters suggested that the phenomenon was a type of superior mirage called Fata Morgana, which is when air temperatures near the surface is much cooler than the air above. Apparently, it can make objects appear to be stacked on top of each other, and usually occurs at sea, in polar regions, or in deserts. Or in this case, like a city in the clouds. However, most people think that what was seen in China was way too high off the ground to be considered an example of Fata Morgana. It's also worth noting that this appeared online long before augmented reality was as easily accessible to the public as it is today. Other more extraordinary theories said it could be a view into a parallel universe, or that this mysterious sighting was possibly a test form of Project Bluebeam, which is said to be a holographic technology designed to create a fake UFO invasion similar to what happens in the 1996 blockbuster Independence Day. In further online discussion, people were taking into consideration holographic technological achievements and wondered if it's too much to consider the real possibility that a top-secret holographic technology was being tested over a heavily populated area in an effort to get an idea of how the general public would react. Strangely, other sightings of cities appearing in the sky have been reported before this one, and probably can't be so easily dismissed as a Fata Morgana mirage or a mere reflection. The incident occurred back in 2012. An entire village in Bauchi, Nigeria, witnessed what they described as a city floating in the clouds. This time, however, much more detail was visible, which clearly could not have been a reflection of their own village. One witness said, "I saw beautiful tall buildings inside it, with tarred roads and cars. It was like a floating city, and from it I could hear machines making noise." Some theories claimed that the village experienced some kind of mass hysteria, while others said that this too could have been a test of holographic technology, but this time in a remote location where it would be unlikely to be captured on video. While many have originally dismissed Project Bluebeam as nothing more than a conspiracy theory, one article published in the Washington Post in 1999 does seem to open up the possibility that this kind of PSYOPs technology was once considered. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, PSYOPs stands for Psychological Operations and refers to non-combative military operations aimed at influencing the enemy's state of mind. In the article, it talks about how the Pentagon once considered a PSYOPs project in 1990. A senior Air Force officer wondered if they could project a holographic image of God floating over Baghdad in a bid to inspire the people and army to rise up against Saddam during the Gulf War. The article goes on to explain that the task was actually handed to a military physicist to look into the feasibility of projecting large three-dimensional objects. It turned out not to be feasible at the time, since they would have needed a mile-wide mirror, a massive supply of power to run the projector, and plus, they didn't know what a god should look like. However, the article concludes that the Washington Post learned that a top-secret program was eventually established in 1994 in pursuit of the technology for special operations and deception missions. If this is true, we can only imagine how much more advanced such secret technology is today, 30 years later. So what do you think the video shows? And what do you think those people in the village saw? Could these be examples of Project Bluebeam? And are there more to come? Coincidences come in many shapes and forms, such as those moments where you think about a friend or relative, and before you know it, they're calling or messaging you. Or like when you're thinking of a song you haven't heard for a while, only for it to play on the radio soon after. Unfortunately, not all coincidences are so innocent, and one such example of this is the curious case of the carbon copy murders. The first of the murders took place in 1817, with the second taking place exactly 157 years later, in 1974. When looking at these two unsolved murder cases separately, although both equally tragic, nothing immediately seems strange. It's only when you actually look into the details and compare the two cases side by side that a tragic series of coincidences is revealed. The 1974 case involved a young woman by the name of Barbara Forrest, who was a 20-year-old brunette woman from the suburb of Erdington, Birmingham, in the United Kingdom. On the 26th of May 1974, Barbara had been out dancing in the city centre, celebrating the bank holiday with her boyfriend Simon. They stayed out late, and at the end of the night Simon escorted Barbara to a nearby bus stop at around 1 a.m. He then went on to another stop to catch a bus back to Moseley where he lived. It's unclear what happened to Barbara after that point. When questioned, none of the other passengers on the number 67 bus she was due to catch could recall seeing her, and Barbara never made it home that night. Sadly, 8 days later her body was found in Pipe Hayes Park, close to where she lived. Investigators found she had been sexually assaulted and then strangled in the early hours of May 27th. Theories that she'd been abducted or had been attacked after getting off the bus were posed, but the most convincing theory was that she had been given a lift from someone she knew. After an appeal from the press and inquiries by the police, a witness came forward to report a blue car that had been parked near where Barbara's body had been found, which coincided with her time of death. Michael Thornton, someone who had worked with Barbara, was identified as the prime suspect in the case. At the hearing at Birmingham Crown Court, it was heard that Mr. Thornton's alibi had been falsified, and also that bloodstains were found on his trousers. However, a week into the trial he was found not guilty and acquitted on the basis of insufficient evidence. Either Mr. Thornton got away with murder, or the true killer was never identified. The other case took place exactly 157 years before Barbara Forrest's murder. Mary Ashford, a 20-year-old brunette from Erdington, along with her friend Hannah Cox, had been out at the Whitsuntide dance at the Tyburn House Inn on the 26th of May 1817. At the dance, Mary met a Mr. Abraham Thornton, and Hannah made acquaintance with a Mr. Benjamin Carter. The four of them stayed until the dance ended at midnight. Mary's body was discovered the following morning in the nearby Pipe Hayes Park. She had been sexually assaulted and then killed, dying in the early hours of the 27th of May. Although her body was found in a flooded pit, evidence indicated that her death was caused by strangulation before the body was thrown into the water. The main suspect was the man she had been with the night before, Mr. Abraham Thornton. He was charged with the murder and stood trial on 2 separate occasions due to an appeal and a retrial, but ultimately, Mr. Thornton was found not guilty and acquitted. Again, either this Mr. Thornton got away with murder, or the true killer was never identified. It's been said that both women had a sort of premonition of their fate, both making predictions that they were in for some bad luck, or had a bad feeling for things to come. While it's very possible that they did, it's hard to prove beyond doubt. So let's just focus on the facts. Both women were 20 years old. Both were brunette and lived in Erdington. Both had been out dancing the night before their death, meeting their demise in the early hours of the 27th of May. They were both sexually assaulted before being killed, more than likely of strangulation in Mary's 1817 case, and definitely in Barbara's 1974 case. Their bodies were both left in Pipe Hayes Park, within 300 yards of each other. Both men accused were ultimately acquitted due to lack of evidence, and both of them were called Mr. Thornton. These crimes were committed 157 years apart, exactly to the day. Perhaps one of Birmingham's darkest examples of history repeating itself. This is an unsolved mystery that might haunt the imaginations of sailors, surfers, and beachgoers. It might even make some of you think twice about heading out into the deeper waters. This is the case of the disappearing great white. It's not so much the disappearance itself that's mysterious, but more the circumstances in which it happened. Back in November of 2003, along the southwestern coast of Australia, Dave Riggs and his film crew were documenting a study of great white sharks, the largest predatory fish on Earth. The researching marine biologists had managed to tag a magnificent 9-foot female, which they decided to name Alpha. She was a strong and healthy adult shark, ideal for the study. Alpha was carefully tagged with a data logger and set loose once more. A data logger was the best option for collecting larger quantities of information over longer periods of time. The downside of using this particular tag was that it didn't provide wireless or GPS information, so it would have to be manually retrieved once the researchers had gathered enough information. Unfortunately, but even more fascinatingly, in this case, the researchers never got the chance to catch up with Alpha and retrieve the tag from her. 4 months later, the tag itself was found washed up on the beach by a passerby who recognized what it was and handed it in for examination. The data that was found on the logger was extraordinary, to say the least. The data clearly showed that Alpha the great white shark had experienced a sudden, sharp plunge down over 1,900 feet, along with a rapid temperature rise. The researchers came to the conclusion that the rapid rise in temperature could only have been reached in the digestive system of a much larger animal. The data suggested that some kind of giant sea creature had suddenly consumed the 9-foot apex predator, whole, before diving down deeply at high speed. Dave Riggs, the marine biologist leading the study, had this to say: "The internal temperature of the animal that ate the shark is a weird one. It appears to be too low for a killer whale, and too high for another shark, unless it was massive." Another more exotic theory is that out there somewhere is an actual sea monster, which swam up and ate the shark before disappearing back into the deepest depths of the ocean. Many would argue that the official theory of a giant megashark capable of swallowing big sharks whole could definitely be classified as an actual sea monster in its own right. Eilean Moor is an uninhabited island off the northwest coast of Scotland. On its highest point stands the 75-foot-tall Flannan Isles Lighthouse, built in the 1890s and first operated on December 7th, 1899. 1 year later, 3 lighthouse keepers working on rotation there completely vanished without a trace. Lush grass grows on the island, and in days gone by, shepherds would often take sheep there to graze in the warmer months, but the shepherds never felt comfortable enough to stay overnight. Locals from the surrounding Hebrides were quite superstitious of the island of Eilean Moor. For hundreds of years, it was believed that supernatural forces were at work there. Others believed, and some still do, that the island is haunted by sea spirits. The official report on the 3 missing lighthouse keepers concluded that they must have been swept out to sea by a violent storm, but too many questions loom over that verdict to satisfy even a slightly inquisitive mind. On the night of December 15th, 1900, a ship passing by the Flannan Isles realised the newly built lighthouse was not operational. Upon landing at Leith, they reported the lighthouse to port authorities, but it seems the Northern Lighthouse Board never got the message. A ship was due to set sail on the 20th of December to drop off supplies for the lighthouse keepers, but due to rough seas, the trip had to be delayed until 6 days later. Captain James Harvey and his crew were tasked with delivering the supplies that day. Also on board was a relief keeper, Joseph Moore, who was said to be quite anxious at the time, pacing around and refusing breakfast. The fact that there were 3 lighthouse keepers on the island and the beacon had not shone for over 10 days was disturbing him. The duty of a keeper was a solemn one, and for a torch to go unlit was virtually unheard of, especially for so long. When the ship arrived at Eileen Moor, a flag was raised to signal their arrival. After a while of waiting, nothing happened. They tried sounding the horn several times, then letting off a flare, but all they were greeted with was silence. The relief keeper, Joseph Moore, was sent ashore to find out what had happened to the light and to the three keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. As he walked up the hill to the lighthouse, Joseph apparently felt a sense of dread wash over him. He approached the building, cautiously pushed open the unlocked door, and slowly entered. Silence hung in the air. Making his way through the lighthouse, he found cold ashes in the fireplace and a half-eaten meal at the table. He also noted the clock had stopped and an overturned chair laid on its back, which indicated to him that someone might have got up in a hurry. He moved on through the lighthouse, the whole time feeling as if he were being watched. He approached the bedrooms with dread, wondering what waited inside, but all he found was empty, unmade beds. The lantern room above was all in order. Lenses were clean, lamp was trimmed, all ready to go. Another strange thing that Joseph noticed was that two of the keepers' waterproof oilskin coats were missing from the lighthouse, but one remained. This part of the world is very wet, windy, and cold much of the time, let alone in the dead of winter. Even on dry days, the ocean spray and wind can rapidly amplify heat loss. Why would one of the keepers leave the lighthouse without this essential piece of clothing? Joseph went back to the ship to report his findings, whereby Captain Harvey ordered a full search of the island. All they managed to find was damage from recent rough weather, causing them to speculate perhaps a freak storm had suddenly come crashing in and swept them all away. The damage, after all, was quite severe. But no such storms were noticed from the nearby inhabited island of Lewis and Harris in the previous days. Furthermore, the three men were experienced keepers with unblemished track records. They had dealt with storms and rough weather for years. Not to mention, it was strict protocol for one keeper to remain in the lighthouse at all times. How could they all have gone missing at once? If a freak storm were the answer for the three lighthouse keepers' disappearance, the bodies of the three unfortunate souls would soon wash up on the shores of Lewis and Harris, and if not, one of the other surrounding Hebridean islands. Speculation soon flared up. The supernatural forces that local folk spoke of were blamed by some. Others say a sea monster was responsible for the devastation and vanishing lighthouse keepers. Others claimed madness and murder. Interestingly, to the scientific mind, madness and murder isn't entirely out of the question. The old lighthouse lamps they used to use actually floated in a bath of mercury to minimize friction in the spinning mechanism. They didn't know it back then, but mercury is highly toxic. The top three side effects of mercury poisoning are anxiety, depression, and irritability. Depression and irritability are self-explanatory, but anxiety is an interesting one. For some people, it causes them to retreat into themselves. For others, it causes them to become very aggressive. Three men stuck on a desolate island, with little to do and nowhere to go, could have been an incident waiting to happen if mercury poisoning had occurred. It's worth noting that if tensions between the men had reached boiling point, wouldn't there be more signs of a struggle if violence had occurred in the lighthouse? Also, is it possible that two of the men could have been calling for urgent help from the third man who remained inside? Hearing their panic, he got up abruptly, tipping his chair on its back, leaving his meal on the table, and leaving his coat behind since there wasn't a moment to spare. The official report at the time ruled that the keepers had all been tragically killed in a freak storm. But truth be told, The bodies were never found, and the circumstances surrounding their disappearance remained shrouded in mystery. All we're left with are questions and theories. What do you think happened on the island of Eileen Moore? Back in 1971, in the city of Belmez, Spain, Maria Gomez noticed a stain forming on the stone floor of her kitchen. Attempts to remove it failed each time. Each day, the stain continued to change and move until it formed the image of what looked like a face. Maria, understandably terrified by the ghostly face peering back at her, continued trying to remove it with cleaning chemicals and scrubbing brushes. This was the result after a few days. Despite these continued desperate attempts, the face remained. Maria's desperation ended up reaching a point where her husband and son destroyed the concrete floor with pickaxes. New cement was laid, but a week later the ghostly face reappeared in the same location as the one they had just removed. The new face was slightly less visible, but still clearly a face, but this time it would be described as being more contorted. Even more faces started to appear. Maria and her family started to believe that these faces were the result of ghosts or spirits trying to communicate with them. Eventually, gossip had spread throughout Belmez. Hundreds of locals queued up for a chance to see the creepy faces for themselves, and local press also covered the story. Maria raised suspicion when it became apparent that she wanted to destroy the second face. Before this could happen, the mayor of Belmez decided to have the concrete surface holding the face removed and examined to see if there were any signs that could indicate that the faces were nothing more than a hoax. After an in-depth analysis, scientists could find no traces of any external manipulation through the use of chemicals, brushes, or paint. With the scientific analysis failing to debunk the faces, many believed it proved that this was a genuine paranormal incident. While the conclusion of the tests became an intriguing yet chilling development in the story, the most astonishing and frightening twist would soon unfold. After removing the section of the kitchen floor, a further deeper excavation took place, where it was discovered that buried underneath the house were the skeletons of several individuals, a few of which were apparently headless. Later they were dated back to the 13th century. A new floor was laid down for Maria and her family. The human remains were then laid to rest with a proper funeral, in the hope that it would mean the end of the chilling mystery. This, however, was not the case. A few weeks later, more faces emerged, described as a woman surrounded by many smaller faces. It was said that the expressions of these faces would change. Sometimes they would look sad, and other times they would look like they were smiling. The new developments continued to baffle skeptics and scientists, especially since all the tests indicated no signs of a hoax. A secondary investigation took place, which required the family to vacate their home for several days. During this period, a sheet of tarpaulin covered the faces, as it was believed that sunlight was a possible cause for the changes to the faces. However, changes are said to still have occurred. The strange phenomenon continued for another 30 years until Maria's death in February 2004. After Maria's death, new faces did appear, but these were quickly proven to be a hoax perpetrated by her second son, as traces of paint were easily detected when testing took place. Even though the original faces remain an unsolved mystery to this very day, the attempted hoax by her son seems to have tarnished the story in the eyes of skeptics and even some believers. Paranormal investigators have more recently theorized that the faces could have been the result of Maria unintentionally projecting the images onto the floor through the alleged phenomena known as thoughtography. Unfortunately, this theory could not be put to the test, since Maria is no longer with us. To paranormal enthusiasts, the repeating phenomenon of the Belmez faces is considered to be one of the 20th century's best documented cases of paranormal activity. Skeptics believe the events to be nothing more than a hoax, but the previously undiscovered 13th century human remains found under the kitchen floor certainly adds credibility for the believers. At 2:05 a.m, in the early hours of December 13, 2013, an unexplained audio recording was made using the sleep monitoring app Sleeper's Android, while Reddit user RedWantsBlue80, also known as Jenny, was sleeping alongside her 3-year-old son. Soon after listening back to the recording, she shared it on Reddit. In the thread, Jenny explained she was home alone with her son that night, and that she had been using the app for months, never once picking up anything out of the ordinary. In the recording, a strange clicking sound can be heard, which seemed to get louder. Some people think this could indicate that whatever was causing it was approaching Jenny and her son, a pretty unnerving thought considering how defenseless we are during sleep. Shortly after the clicking, a female voice, believed to be Jenny, since she admits she's known to talk in her sleep, can be heard saying, "What are you doing?" And this is where it gets even more unnerving. A deeper male-sounding voice responds, "Nothing." A few more clicks are heard again, before the deeper voice says what sounds like, "That's them." This is the recording Jenny made that night.
What are you doing? Okay. That's right.
Listen again, this time with increased volume and reduced background noise.
What are you doing? Okay. That's right.
With the male-sounding voice going unexplained, one curious Reddit user by the name of Finderbaron was keen to do some extensive audio analysis to confirm whether or not Jenny was responsible. After getting in contact with Jenny, she supplied him with separate voice samples of herself and her son for a comparative analysis. Based on the fact that the unexplained voice was significantly lower in pitch, he concluded that the other voice in the recording was not Jenny. Included in his analysis were screenshots of his audio visualizer, demonstrating the difference in pitch at the point where the male voice says, "That's them." Multiple theories were discussed on Reddit. One popular suggestion was that it could have been burglars who were caught off guard by Jenny, who may have been in between sleep. Other Redditors who agreed with this theory also suggested that maybe the clicking sound could have been a torch being switched on and off repetitively, since that kind of behaviour might make sense if an intruder was nervous. Of course, there are those who believe something paranormal could have occurred, and this theory is made a little more convincing by something her son said. The day after the recording, Jenny's son asked her where Ho was. She asked him to explain who that was, and he replied, "The black guy with no face." Although this sounds very creepy, Jenny said that he would often say some odd things at times, and doesn't think it was related to the recording. What do you think it was? Airliners are huge and expensive vehicles, so it's hard to imagine that one could be lost. However, that's exactly what happened to a Boeing 727, which belonged to a Miami-based aerospace sales and leasing company. The plane in question had been parked at Angola's 4 de Fevereiro airport for over a year, and in that time it had built up at least $4 million worth of unpaid airport fees. At around 5 p.m. on May 25, 2003, the 727 was taken by an American pilot and engineer named Ben Padilla and a Congolese mechanic named John Mutantu. Both men boarded the 727, which they had been working maintenance on for weeks. They then ignored calls from the airport's control tower, who noticed them moving the plane to a takeoff position. Despite the fact that neither one of them were actually qualified to fly the plane, they flew off into the sunset and were never seen again. This was strange, not just because these men were trusted professionals, but the 727 usually requires a crew of 3. Could it be possible there was a third unknown person involved? Keeping in mind that this happened less than 2 years after the New York tragedy involving the 2 tall buildings, it's only natural that the first theory was that the theft could be linked to a potential threat similar to the Towers event in 2001. Without evidence to believe otherwise, intelligence agencies began a frantic search for the missing 727 and wanted to know more about the men who took it. Strangely, to this day, or at least at the time of recording, not much is known about John Mutantu. As far as we're aware, there are no photos of him and no family statements in the media, which is very peculiar whichever way you look at the situation. A missing man, guilty or innocent, would normally have images released to the press. In contrast to John Mutantu, there are multiple interviews and testimonies about Ben Padilla. His family describe him as someone who had always been interested in aeronautics. He was also said to have enjoyed working in distant locations such as Southeast Asia, South America, and Africa. On the whole, most character profiles were very positive. However, one former employer said Ben was only interested in chasing local women, and reported that he once left a hotel without paying the $10,000 bill. Ben Padilla's brother refuses to believe he took the plane voluntarily and thinks it was hijacked by terrorists. He also claims that he and Ben actually discussed the possibility of a hijacking, and Ben said he would choose to crash the plane rather than fly it anywhere against his will. Before being sold to the Miami-based aircraft agency, the plane was previously a passenger jet for American Airlines. It was still silver in colour and still had the blue, red and white stripes. Apart from that and the serial number, there was nothing distinctive about its exterior. Prior to being stolen, it was in the process of being repurposed to carry diesel to Angolan diamond mines. Most of the aircraft's interior had been removed to allow room for 10 500-gallon fuel tanks. If these tanks were full during some kind of attack, you can only imagine the destruction it would have caused. Despite intensive searches being undertaken by the CIA and FBI in locations such as Sri Lanka and Nigeria, no trace of the airliner was found. According to the Charlie Project, which is an organisation dedicated to cold cases, the 727 was last thought to be heading towards the Seychelles Islands. Other online sources claim it even requested landing permission but never actually landed. One theory suggested that if it was a terror-related incident, the target could be the American bases in Diego Garcia, which is around 1,200 miles beyond the Seychelles. The problem with this theory is that 727s only have a flight range of 3,000 miles on a full tank, and Diego Garcia is just over 4,000 miles away from the 4 de Febrero airport. Also, it's accepted that the stolen 727 in question only had 2,000 miles worth of fuel left in the tank, limiting it to this radius. Eventually, the US authorities came to the conclusion that there was no terror connection, and the decision was made to scale down the investigation. At this point, people began to look deeper into the company that owned the plane, and came up with theories linked to insurance fraud. At the time of its disappearance, the plane was being leased to a man named Keith Irwin. Irwin had procured the aircraft in February 2002 from the Florida-based aerospace company, which was owned by a man named Maury Joseph. As we're already aware, the plane was going to be used for delivering diesel to diamond mines in Angola. Irwin only had the plane for a short time before he began missing payments. Joseph arranged for an Air Gemini crew to fly the 727 back on May 26, 2003, but as we already know, it had been stolen at this time. Investigators began to suspect that Maury Joseph had hired Ben Padilla and John Mutantu as part of an insurance scheme to recoup his losses. It was later revealed that Joseph had prior fraud charges against him. A few years earlier, the Securities and Exchange Commission had charged him with falsifying financial statements and defrauding investors. He was heavily fined and banned from serving as an officer in a publicly held company ever again. Naturally, this would raise suspicion, but Maury Joseph was quick to get in contact with the FBI and volunteered to take a lie detector test, which he passed, removing any further suspicion against him. The case was seemingly well and truly cold, but then, in early November 2009, the wreckage of a 727 was discovered abandoned in the Saharan desert of Mali in West Africa. This was significant because it was one of the countries that fell within the 2,000-mile radius the plane could have possibly reached. At first, it was believed the 727 had crash-landed, but a closer look revealed that a nearby prehistoric lakebed had been converted into a makeshift runway, and that the aircraft had landed there before being deliberately set ablaze. Answers about the origins of the wrecked 727 were delayed, since it turned out that the newly discovered 727 carried a false registration belonging to a Saudi Arabian airline. The real 727 with that registration had been destroyed in an accident sometime before. An international investigation linked the wreckage of the 727 to the trafficking of huge amounts of cash and narcotics between Colombia, West Africa, and Europe. According to a UN crime agency, after the plane's final journey, it was destroyed by the traffickers. Considering the fact that very few 727s are unaccounted for, the probabilities of the wreckage being the Angola 727, stolen 6 years earlier, are pretty high, but it's still not confirmed. The sad fact is that there is still no sign of Ben Padilla and John Mutantu. If they were involved in the theft, they could either be living out a wealthy retirement somewhere in the world, or they've been silenced. Either way, there's still no closure for their friends and families. What do you think really happened? In January 2012, Antarctica researchers were left mystified after viewing a satellite image that showed a strange oval-shaped structure in the ice, leaving some to suggest it was man-made. The image was sent back by the GEO-I-1 Earth observation satellite and was then first revealed on the Science Channel's show What on Earth? The image was analysed and was estimated to measure at roughly 400 feet wide, and to make things a little stranger, it's located in one of the most isolated and unexplored regions on Earth. In a segment from the show, archaeologist Mark Alterwheel had this to say: "It's the kind of thing that if you see it anywhere in the world, you immediately say, that's definitely man-made." One natural theory put forward suggested that they could be caused by katabatic winds, which cause dune-like formations called sastrugi. However, this theory was ruled out since sastrugi tend to create sharp, wave-like formations that are long and linear and run parallel to the direction of the wind. Another possible explanation put forward by Professor of Geographical Sciences Jonathan Bramber in 2017 suggested that the dark patches were surface ice melt that collected into ponds, forming what are called supraglacial lakes. If those ponds drain out, they can leave an empty space under the ice, which then could collapse and possibly form shapes such as the ones seen in the satellite image. The problem is, the ice sheets in that particular region are so extremely thick they're unlikely to collapse at all, leaving researchers unable to come to a firm conclusion as to what exactly this anomaly really is. Until we're able to investigate it more closely, we'll never know. The story of Father Carlos Crespi and his amazing collection of ancient artifacts is known to few and is shrouded in mystery, due in part to questions surrounding where the artifacts actually came from. Equally as mysterious is how some of the more controversial pieces went missing after his death. Carlos Crespi was born in Italy in 1891 and grew up to study anthropology at the University of Milan, before later studying archaeology in Venice. In 1917, he made the decision to become a priest and was placed in the Ecuadorian city of Cuenca by the Vatican in 1923. There, he dedicated the last 59 years of his life spreading the word of the gospel, as well as helping the people in practical ways by establishing orphanages and schools. He also used a basic knowledge of farming and his expertise in anthropology to help people become a much more self-sufficient and thriving community. In a show of gratitude for his humanitarian work and knowing his love for archaeology, local people began bringing Father Crespi a variety of amazing ancient artifacts. Inscribed metal and gold plates, some apparently displaying unknown languages, were amongst the fascinating items that found their way into a collection that eventually reached an estimated 50,000 individual items. It's worth mentioning that on some occasions, locals brought artifacts in exchange for small sums of money or even food. This unfortunately encouraged some to bring objects that were obvious fakes or items of no historical significance whatsoever. Separating the authentic from the worthless, the kind-hearted man received all objects gratefully, regardless of their value. As a result of his growing collection, the Vatican allowed Father Crespi to open a museum. While the collection in itself is pretty incredible, as mentioned before, the sources, origins, and eventual fate of many of these artifacts is what truly captures the attention of those who come to know of the Father Crespi mystery. You see, some of the relics seemed out of place. For example, this artifact appears to have originated from ancient Babylonia.
Any archaeologist who
Vaya, ese es el
has
faraón.
studied the Sumerian,
Permíteme.
Babylonian,
El
Assyrian
faraón,
cultures,
no, ese es el faraón, no. El rey de Babilonia.
This is particularly strange because this ancient civilization existed thousands of years ago in what we know now as Iraq. The same goes for this item, which looks Sumerian. Could this really be one of the sources of Father Crespi's incredible artifacts? If this is the case, How on earth did they find their way to Cuenca, over 8,000 miles away? It's also been speculated that some of the other relics could have been from unknown civilizations which may have existed in areas of the South American continent before it was covered in thick rainforests. While this may seem far-fetched, bear in mind that LiDAR has revealed complex structures and even cities beneath the forests which were previously undiscovered, so the possibility of unknown civilizations existing throughout what are now clearly inhospitable areas of thick and deep forest is not so far-fetched.
The Amazon basin is 7 million square kilometers in area. And within it, 5.5 million square kilometers remains almost entirely unstudied by archaeologists. And to put that into perspective, 5.5 million square kilometers is the size of the entire Indian subcontinent.
Further extraordinary claims describe how the artifacts could have come from secret rooms, described as metallic libraries, found deep within the vast network of caves, starting on the eastern slopes of the Andes Mountains, known as Cueva de los Teos, or Cave of the Oilbirds in English. One of the 3 known entrances to the caves is located in an area where the Shuar natives have lived for an estimated 2,500 years. Some believe that either the tribe were, or still are, guarding secrets of what the cave holds, or even that the secrets are now lost to these natives too. Obviously, when doing a deep dive into any subject online, you definitely need a skeptical yet curious outlook. Some online sources referred to claims that the caves are part of a subterranean complex that extend through to Venezuela and Chile. However, while researching further information for this video, we were not able to confirm this as fact, and given the distance between these countries, it seems unlikely. Obviously, such stories have to be taken with a pinch of salt, but at the time we did find examples of other caves, such as Kentucky's Mammoth Cave National Park, which is described as a limestone labyrinth with more than 400 miles of explored area, and has potential for a further 600 miles in its system yet to be explored, so it's entirely possible that a similar system could exist beneath Ecuador and beyond. Fueling these extraordinary claims is the story of an expedition that apparently took place in 1969. In the 1973 book, The Gold of the Gods, Eric von Daniken, who many consider a pseudo-archaeologist, wrote that explorer Janos Juan Moritz found large quantities of gold, strange sculptural artifacts, and a metallic library during his explorations deep within the Ecuadorian caves. The explorer also described the characteristics of the tunnels as artificial in appearance, stating that he believed that they had been created by a lost civilization with the help of extraterrestrial beings. Claims such as this, of course, are once again to be taken with a pinch of salt. Sadly, it's often that claims of ET intervention lead many people to completely dismiss an entire story, which is understandable to some extent. But the possibility of amazing human accomplishment without ET intervention shouldn't be ruled out in this case. Influenced by Daniken's book, a 1976 deep exploration of the caves of Teos involving a team of over 100 people was arranged by the Scottish engineer and explorer Stan Hall, the same man previously seen in footage with Father Crespi. At the time, it was one of the most expensive and ambitious cave explorations ever put together. The expedition team included 8 experienced cavers from the UK, a film crew, British and Ecuadorian military personnel, and various other individuals with expertise in a number of significant fields. Most notably, amongst the team was the American astronaut Neil Armstrong. Unfortunately, the search yielded no significant findings. However, it's been claimed that the indigenous sources who had originally tipped off Janos Juan Moritz later met with Stan Hall's lead researcher and informed them that they had investigated the wrong cave. Going back to the Crespi collection, in 1962, tragedy struck when a fire tore through his museum and destroyed a huge number of the objects held within. Then in 1982, when Father Crespi passed away, some of the surviving artifacts went missing. Multiple theories of their fate have been raised. It's been speculated that the more controversial relics were taken by the Vatican and are now being held in their vast vaults. Other ideas suggest that they might have been stolen and then sold to private collectors. Another possibility is that they may have been reclaimed by the local natives and returned to the secret areas deep within the caves. One thing we do know to be fact, however, is that the Central Bank of Ecuador did purchase some of the remaining items of the Father Crespi collection. This is because in 2016, contributors from the website and organisation Ancient Origins were given permission to examine the objects which were purchased. While they did view thousands of the amazing ancient artifacts such as figurines, ceremonial seats, weapons, stone carvings, ceramics, jewellery, ancient calculation systems, religious icons, and elongated skulls, they were left disappointed to find that the collection contained none of the significant and controversial artifacts, no items depicting hieroglyphs from an unknown civilization, and no golden plates from the metal library. They did question the whereabouts of the plates and were told that those particular items were nothing but junk, proven to be fakes. When escorted to the items, they confirmed that these particular items were in fact worthless. So does this totally prove that all of the extraordinary details of Father Crespi's story were completely sensationalized and exaggerated? Some may understandably come to that conclusion, but what still remains unanswered is perhaps what will continue to fuel interest in the region and the collection. You see, the whereabouts of the artifacts which Father Crespi was so proudly showing the crew who photographed them during their visit in the 1970s are nowhere to be found. Where are the gold carvings covered in hieroglyphs? And where are the seemingly Sumerian figures seen in the footage? They definitely did exist. Were they lost in the fire, looted and stolen? Or are they currently being held in a secret location due to the information that they hold and the truth that they may reveal? Interestingly, Eileen Hall, the daughter of the explorer Stan Hall, who led the expedition in 1976, has chosen to follow in her father's footsteps and return to the caves. In an interview with the Daily Mail, she said, "I am determined in my lifetime to get to the bottom of what my father and Neil Armstrong started all those years ago. I believe the treasure cave exists, and I intend to do all that I can to realise my father's dream of finding it." If Eileen Hall is correct, it may only be a matter of years before a huge piece of the Father Crespi puzzle is unlocked. Until that day, or unless new evidence is unearthed, it's likely that both the origins of the strange artifacts and the location of the most interesting of them will remain a mystery. Would you ever fake your own death in order to escape something in your life and to start a new one? This is one of several theories behind the fate of Alfred Lowenstein, whose case is one of the most enigmatic unsolved mysteries in modern history. In 1928, Belgian financier and wealthy entrepreneur Alfred Lowenstein was the world's third richest man when he supposedly fell 4,000 feet into the English Channel. On July 4th, Lowenstein, a professional airman himself, and 6 of his employees boarded his private plane, a Fokker Trimotor, which took off from Croydon Airport and was headed to Brussels, Lowenstein's home city. This was a routine flight, as the wealthy banker lived there with his wife Madeleine. On that fateful day, the skies were clear, the weather was fine, and the flight could not be smoother. As the aircraft was flying over the English Channel, Lowenstein went to use the bathroom at the rear of the plane. After what felt like a fairly long time, Lowenstein's valet went to check on him to make sure that he was okay, but to his great surprise, Lowenstein was gone. After the valet reported the shocking disappearance to the rest of the crew, pilot Donald Drew made an emergency landing on the beach of St. Paul, near Dunkirk, France. All the people on board were questioned, and an investigation was conducted by the French authorities. 15 days after a failed search and rescue operation, Lowenstein's body was found by local fishermen, floating in the sea just off the French coast. The body was in such a bad state of decay that the fishermen could barely stomach the smell. The captain of the ship identified Lowenstein by his wristwatch. which had his name and address inscribed on it. An autopsy was requested by his widow, which revealed that every bone in his body had been broken by the 4,000-foot fall, but there was neither any evidence of foul play or that Lowenstein had taken his own life. The crew gave their testimony, and the death was officially declared an accident, although the odd circumstances around this case left many people in doubt. It's quite unlikely that Lowenstein magically dematerialized or was somehow Star Trek beamed from the aircraft. So what actually happened? Was it really an accident? Had Lowenstein stepped into the sky instead of the cabin, perhaps during turbulence? Surely you've got to be extremely absent-minded to make such a mistake. Based on testimony from both the pilot and the mechanic in charge of the aircraft, the exit door was easy to open. However, the integrity of the small aeroplane's door was thoroughly tested by the British Air Ministry, who claimed it would have been impossible for it to be opened by accident. This detail should have certainly raised suspicion, as it indicated that the pilot and the mechanic were lying. When his remains were examined, there were traces of alcohol in Lowenstein's blood. This was strange, because it was known that he never drank, and he wasn't seen drinking on the flight. If on this occasion he was under the influence, could it be that the exit door had accidentally been left open on takeoff, and Tipsy Alfred leaned or bumped against it and fell out? Or maybe he just got confused and went for the exit door instead of the bathroom. It doesn't sound likely. As it shows in these diagrams, the rear compartment of the aircraft was separated from the cabin. If someone stepped into the back of the plane, the exit door would have been on the right and the bathroom would have been on their left. Did he take his own life? It was said that Lowenstein always seemed in good spirits and enthusiastic about his future plans. But nobody can ever tell what really goes on in other people's minds. It could well be that he did make this decision. You see, his corrupt business practices were about to be exposed. But, if this is the case, how did he actually do it? And why choose such a bizarre method? Surely you would choose a method that didn't implicate the involvement of other people. Another intriguing hypothesis is that he faked his own death to escape impending financial or legal troubles, or because he had a secret affair and eloped with one of his housemaids. It was reported that Lowenstein had withdrawn a large sum of money a few days before July the 4th, so perhaps he carefully engineered his own death, bribed all his employees on board, and the aircraft landed somewhere else to let him off, before it officially landed where the accident was reported. Or, perhaps he had never been on the plane at all. With the body only being identified by the watch, could the battered old remains have just been some other poor soul who matched Lowenstein's build? The most thrilling theory is that the crew on board of the plane were all involved, a bit like Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. Was he forced out? And if yes, by whom and why? Apparently, two men especially benefited from his death: his business partners, Albert Pam and Frederick Zarvazy. This was thanks to various company insurance policies hedging against Lowenstein's death. It may be that Pam and Zarvazy paid pilot Donald Drew and mechanic Robert Little to eliminate Lowenstein and convince everyone about how easy it was to open the exit door. But how would they have done it without anyone else noticing? Like any other wealthy and powerful men in the world, Lowenstein had a great deal of enemies. In 1926, he established international holdings, which raised large amounts of money from numerous investors. By 1928, these shareholders wanted some return on their stake, and they wanted it sooner rather than later. So conceivably, any of these rich investors could have commissioned one or more members of the crew to commit the murder. There were also rumours that Lowenstein had been involved with American crime boss Arnold Rothstein, so could it be that the latter had a score to settle with the banker? What about his wife Madeline? Apparently they had a loveless marriage. Could she have been so desperate to get her hands on his fortune? She could have paid the staff to forcibly throw him out of the plane. It seems that she was so busy investing the fortune that she had just inherited that she didn't even turn up to her own husband's funeral. In 1987, author William Norris published a book called The Man Who Fell from the Sky, where he brought to light some curious details about this story. Why did pilot Donald Drew decide to land on an empty beach instead of the nearby airfield at St. Inglevert? Norris's theory was so that another rear door, previously hidden on board the plane, could be fitted to replace a fake one dumped over the channel. This fits neatly with the story given by a French fisherman who recalled seeing something like a parachute falling from the sky at precisely the moment Lowenstein went missing. With the door removed, Lowenstein could have easily been pushed or thrown to his death. This supports Norris's theory that Lowenstein's business partners, Pam and Svarvesi, hired at least 2 people to kill Alfred, most likely the 2 people who gave convincing testimonies about how easy it was to open the exit door: the pilot, Donald Drew, and the mechanic, Robert Little. 1 year after Lowenstein's mysterious disappearance, the stock market crash led to the Great Depression, and some years later, his son Robert shot one of his servants under suspicious circumstances. Bad luck seemed like it really followed the Lowenstein family. Robert himself then also died in an aeroplane accident in 1941. Alfred Lowenstein's bizarre vanishing left the Air Force baffled, and the more theories and testimonies surface, the more confusing his death appears to be. So, was it the perfect crime? Or was it really just a bizarre accident? In such cases, you really wish Agatha Christie's famous Belgian sleuth, Poirot, was not just a fictional character, as he would have confidently solved this incredible mystery. No one was ever charged with the murder, nor even directly accused. Alfred Lowenstein was so despised that he ended up being buried in an unmarked grave, which also seems suspicious. Despite all the theories and possibilities posed, this mystery is likely to remain frustratingly unsolved. On the 27th of December 2018, a 1,950-ton oil cargo ship named the Namzi Bangzod departed with 1 million litres of crude palm oil from the Indonesian port town of Sampit in central Kalimantan, heading for the port of Tanjung, Jakarta. On board were 11 crew members and their captain. Its arrival was expected just the following day, but on the 28th of December, communication was lost with the massive vessel. As the ship was sailing on a pre-planned route, the Indonesian Navy were able to establish that something must have gone wrong, since it recorded unexpected changes in position on multiple occasions via the ship's automatic tracking system. Even with this technology, the exact whereabouts of the Namzi Bangzod was never fully established. After 3 days of searching, the National Search and Rescue Agency concluded that the disappearance of the tanker was, as they believe, likely to have been due to a pirate hijacking, which could explain the earlier changes in its route. They also added that since it was a matter of piracy, the search was no longer their responsibility. One of the last data inputs was tracked by officials on the 3rd of January 2019 at 9:42 AM, while the ship was somewhere in Ujung Karawang waters. Since this area was considered to be very safe, the Navy disagreed that the ship had been hijacked by pirates. Furthermore, they also added that there had been no demand for ransom for the cargo or the hostages. Theories regarding this response stated that just because the ship was travelling along a usually safe route, it doesn't mean that they couldn't be intercepted by pirates anyway. There are also theories that perhaps selling the valuable cargo could have been the objective, not a ransom. If this was the case, then the fate of the crew on board looks even more unsettling. The Navy also reported that the ship had been recorded changing position several more times, moving from Jakarta Bay to Sunda Kelapa Port, but was never found or seen in either location. On January 6th, the ship was tracked again, this time with a course pattern that was described by the Marine Bulletin as being rather hectic and kind of confused, which would possibly suggest that it could in fact have been under pirate control at this point, and they may not have had the necessary experience to handle the massive ship. In an interview with Wikinews Investigates, Dr. Tristan Smith, a shipping researcher of University College London, explained that crews may sometimes turn their trackers off deliberately to avoid being tracked for safety reasons, for example, in areas where piracy is high risk. Also in the same article, Doug Miller of Miltech Marine, a firm specialising in the tracking technology used on the missing ship, explained that the transponder would broadcast automatically as long as it had power and a functioning antenna, even if the crew were no longer on the ship. So what could this possibly mean? It seems like the ship was trying to avoid detection on some occasions, but then allowing themselves to broadcast a signal on others. Why would this be the case? It also seems to suggest that if pirates were responsible, they would likely have knowledge of the tracking systems, but still, why would they turn them back on at all? One possible theory is that the ship had its identity stolen, with the imposter vessel conducting maneuvers in various locations and turning the signal on and off, falsely transmitting information, identifying itself as the Namzi Bangzod. Meanwhile, the cargo of palm oil, which would eventually have expired, could have been sold on some kind of black market. Maritime expert Alon Sout-Gurning said that an accident was very unlikely to have taken place, since no distress signal had been sent, and he also does not believe the tanker is adrift at sea, as the Navy would have found it by now. The disappearance of the ship is one thing, but it also raises the important question: what happened to the ship's crew and their captain?